Hello and good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I
All right.
can hear you.
All right. Thank you. So in this class, we're going to be talking about adverse drug reactions, and essentially, I will be taking you through definitions for adverse drug reactions, and also we will talk about classification. We'll talk about how to report adverse drug reactions in Nigeria, and then we'll look at a few questions. Please ensure you mute yourself. Okay. So basically that's our learning objective. Like I said, we'll do a few definitions, distinguish between ADRs and ADEs, and then we'll look at classification. We'll also look at how to grade different types of adverse drug reactions. And then someone is still, okay. So very quickly, we're going to look at the outline I have just talked about. Adverse drug reactions are an unwanted, undesirable effect of a medication that occurs during its normal, legitimate use, and adverse drug reactions occur almost daily in healthcare institutions and can adversely affect the patient's quality of life. In fact, due to adverse events or adverse reactions, some patients may discontinue their medicines, and that leads to worsening of whatever condition they have, or sometimes it may lead to death, right? Now, a lot of attention has been given to identifying patient populations that are most at risk. And we're going to talk about, I think, about 4 of them, pediatrics, geriatrics, and I think 2 other classes before the end of this class. The reason is because there's an increasing number of medicines with complex interaction mechanisms, complex ways in which they interact with our body available in the market. And of course, there are increasingly more variations or genetic variations within our population. So that's leading to also a number of our population, people are getting older. Yes, Africa still remains the youngest population in the world, but then, I mean, generally we're still having more people living longer now than in previous years. And so a number of our population that are getting older are also experiencing something called polypharmacy. I'm certain all of you have experienced or you know what is polypharmacy, since most of you are supposed to be in what's it called, in clerkship right now. So if you have a question while I'm speaking, please you do well to just raise your hand. I will see it from here. Okay. Now, adverse drug reactions may also cause patients to lose confidence in the healthcare system. It can lead to healthcare avoidance and lead to the patient approaching, going for agbo, that's herbs and alternative medicines. And of course, these can also compound the adverse effects or also lead to their own unique adverse events and you know, compound the situation of the patient. Generally, that leads to increased costs, medical costs for both the system and the patient. And that's one of the reasons why pharmacovigilance was founded, to ensure that some of these adverse events are prevented, managed, or if they do occur, to ensure they do not occur again. So therefore, adverse drug reactions should be quickly identified and managed to limit their detrimental effects on the patient. Okay, there are a couple of definitions that I would like to give us, but before we get there, let me talk quickly about pharmacovigilance. Pharmacovigilance involves the study of adverse drug related injuries, that's drug-related injuries, and it allows you to warn or recommend withdrawal of a medicine. I'm sure a number of you going through your clinical report forms, you would have seen that you're required to make 4 drug-related reports, I think, during your clinical posting. In that place, you'll find out that there's a method to identifying a drug, an adverse drug reaction. Now, that process of identifying the adverse drug reaction, documenting it, reporting it, and recommending action and following up after recommending the action is called a pharmacovigilance activity. What it does is it encompasses detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse drug reactions. And pharmacists play the most vital role in this step by taking the lead in, since it's usually drug related. So pharmacists take the lead to identify the drug that's causing the specific reaction, assess how much damage has been caused by the medicine, and then also take action to prevent if it's if it's not a currently occurring adverse drug reaction, if it's sorry. Okay. So like I said, pharmacists take the lead in identifying, in assessing, and in, of course, recommending solutions to adverse drug reactions under the pharmacovigilance scheme. Nigeria has a policy, a pharmacovigilance policy, which we're also going to look at before the end of this session. So let's start by defining an adverse drug reaction in order to differentiate it from other types of events that can happen. The definition of an adverse drug reaction, okay? The definition of an adverse drug reaction is often confused with that of an adverse drug event. This is definition of an adverse drug event. And it's any untoward. The adverse drug event, I think this is a very simple way to understand it. An adverse drug event is the umbrella term that encompasses adverse drug reactions. Please take note of that. Adverse drug event is the umbrella term that encompasses everything involved with adverse drug reaction, side effects, and sometimes something called serious adverse reaction or unexpected adverse reaction. Okay. Now, one of the things I need you to note between the adverse drug reaction and the adverse drug event is that the adverse drug event is any untoward medical occurrence that may present during treatment with a pharmaceutical product. So you could be using an inhaler, you could be using a tablet, you could be using a capsule, you could be using a cream, whatever it is, you must be using a pharmaceutical product at that time, but it does not necessarily have a causal relationship with the drug being used. So the event being experienced does not directly have, or you do not need to establish any causal relationship with the treatment the patient is taking for you to be able to identify an adverse drug event. Now, for an adverse drug reaction, The WHO defines it as a response to a drug which is noxious. So first and foremost, it is harmful, it's unintended, and it occurs at doses normally used for prophylaxis, diagnosis, for therapy of disease, or for modification of physiological functions. That's a key differentiation between the two, right? An ADR is a type of ADE whose cause can be directly attributed to a drug and its physiological or pharmacological property. Okay? Like I said, if you need to stop me along the line, please just raise your hand and I will be glad to quickly to stop for any questions. Okay. Now, so that main distinction between ADR and ADE is that ADR occur despite appropriate prescribing and dosing. Okay? Even though you have ensured that the right drug is given to the right patient at the right time, in the right dosage, at the right frequency, for the right duration, for the right indication, in spite of all of the 7 rights, be aware that an adverse drug reaction can still occur, okay? So despite ensuring appropriate prescribing and dosing, an adverse reaction can occur. Meanwhile, adverse drug events may be associated with inappropriate use of drugs or other confounders that occur during drug therapy, but not necessarily as a result of the pharmacology of the drug itself, okay? So a causal relationship is suspected for an ADR, right? But is not required for an ADE. Now, there are a couple of other definitions for ADEs and ADRs. But if you look at this, schematic on your screen, you would notice that the 2 bigger concentric circles, medication errors and adverse drug events, may sometimes overlap. And where they overlap is where you find that there could be more serious harm done to the patient. But in spite of the overlap of medication errors and adverse drug reactions or events, please be aware that you do not need any medication error for an adverse reaction to occur, and you do not need a medication error for an adverse drug event to occur, even though when there's a medication error, you may have both of these instances occurring, okay? Just to go back again, a medication error occurs during prescribing, transcribing, interpretation of that's interpretation of the prescription, or dispensing when you're administering, or it could be as a result of inappropriate adherence, whatever. It occurs during that professional act of providing the medication to the patient. But during the use of the patient, in spite of ensuring that everything is properly done, the patient can still have an adverse drug reaction. That is very important. Now let's quickly take I want to quickly take a short can you see the question on your screen? Can you see the question on your screen?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, so I wanted to answer only question 1 and 2. Answer only question 1 and 2. If you're on this Zoom call, you have to attempt the poll. So please respond to the question on the screen, question 1 and 2. Oh, do you have to answer everything before you submit? I think you can answer just those 2 questions and submit, can't you?
No, we can't, sir.
You can't?
Yes,
We
sir.
can't.
Oh, okay, no problem. Just fill in. I know we've not handled sections 3 and 4. Just guess your way through 3 and 4, but I'll still address those later. So for now, please answer questions 1 and 2. We have 65 people on the call, so you need to respond to the poll.
So, sir, are you saying we should just attempt 3 and 4 and submit?
Yes.
Okay.
No, attempt 1 and 2, then submit.
But we can't submit unless we've done everything.
Okay, so do everything, then submit. I will just address only 1 and 2 for now.
Okay, sir.
If only his options can be this skewed in the exam. Hey, the speakers all know.
We have only 33 responses so far. Okay, so we need to continue. There's still a lot to cover. Okay. So can you see the result?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay. Now, so for question 1, an ADR is different from an ADE since most people said an ADR is caused by a specific drug the patient is taking, while an ADE does not require causation. That is correct. Question number 2. Of course, options 1, which is there are both types of medication errors, is wrong, since they are not types of medication errors. Option C, AD is caused by a specific drug the patient is taking, is also wrong, since we said that adverse drug events do not require causation. The last option, is of course just wrong. ADR is not more serious than an ADE since it's a type of ADE. Question number 2. An adverse drug reaction can often happen when there is no medication error. True. Like I emphasized a lot before we took the poll, an adverse drug reaction can occur even when you have followed all of the 7 rights. So it can occur when there is no medication error. Okay, so let's get back to all right. So we've talked about definitions for ADR, ADE, and looked at medication errors. We also looked at why that is different. Now, another concept you should be aware of is the side effect. A side effect is expected, is an expected and known effect of a drug that is not the intended therapeutic outcome, but it's related to the pharmacology of the medicine in use. For example, what examples readily come to mind?
Nausea, vomiting.
From what type of drug?
Anti-cancer drugs, chemo drugs.
Excellent, excellent.
Also,
for example,
antibiotics.
Yes, go ahead.
Also antibiotics. Also some antibiotics too.
Correct. Almost all drugs can be said to cause nausea and vomiting. But of course, if we look more specifically at, we can say coughing caused by angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, right? ACE inhibitors like captopril have an important side effect of cough, of dry cough, right? So that's important for that. Now, an allergy, on the other hand, is immune mediated, and that's different from a side effect, even though it's a known relationship. Now, on the spectrum of adverse drug reactions, you can have those mediated by through the immune system. We can have immunologic and non-immunologic, and this also helps us classify some of the ADRs that we see in practice. So ADRs that are immunologic are often described as either type 1 reaction, type 2 reaction, type 3 reaction. Type 1 is IG mediated and are usually very serious. For example, anaphylaxis from beta-lactam antibiotics. Anaphylaxis can usually will usually result to a serious event and requires withdrawal of the drug. Type 2 reactions like the like cytotoxics, hemolytic anemia from penicillins. Type 3 reactions, immune complexes are built. Immune complexes are large agglutinations of immune response cells that come together. And once that happens, it happens late in an immune process, but once that happens, there's severe immune reaction. For example, serum sickness from antithymocyte globulin. Antithymocyte globulin, usually, if not properly purified, can result into serum sickness. So that's an important reaction that is usually reported. Now, type 4 reactions are delayed and cell mediated. For example, contact dermatitis from topical antihistamines. Also toxic epidermal necrolysis. And you can see others from drug-induced lupus-like syndrome. Then on the non-immunologic spectrum, so we have immunologic, non-immunologic. On non-immunologic, it's similar to the usual classifications we have type A and type B. So you have predictable and unpredictable. Of course, predictable has certain characteristics. Their pharmacological they are related. Those actions are related to the pharmacological effects of the drug. They are also secondary pharmacologic side effects. For example, thrush while taking antibiotics, or thrush from taking inhaled corticosteroids, without washing or gargling with water after inhalation. They can also result from drug toxicity. For example, you have hepatotoxicity from methotrexate, which is very common, and that's why dosing for methotrexate usually follows testing, and also it's graded. There can also be drug-drug interactions as part of the predictable non-immunologic ADRs, and that can, for example, be seizures from theophylline when you're taking erythromycin. The unpredictable ones are usually pseudo-allergic, idiosyncratic, and intolerance. They may result from intolerance to the medicine being used. Now, there are other classifications. The usual classification, that classification is based on involvement of the immune system. Now, there's another classification which is graded in 5 steps. The first is type A, which is dose-related. Okay, dose-related, and it's also sometimes called augmented effect. Okay. So there's type A, which is augmented. It's common and it's related to the physiological action of the drug. Like I said, it's similar to non-immunologic type A. The examples are similar. You can also have dry mouth with tricyclic antidepressants, or respiratory depression with opioids. There's type B, which is non-dose related. It's sometimes also called bizarre, B-I-Z-A-R-R-E. That's type B. It's uncommon. It's not related to the pharmacologic action of the drug. It's unpredictable and results in high mortality. For example, anaphylaxis to penicillin is also considered a type B ADR. Now, for type C reactions, they're dose-related and time-related. So it is chronic. Type C is another what's it called? Another word for type C is chronic ADR. Like I said, they are dose-related and they are time-related. It's uncommon and it's related to the cumulative dose of the drug. How many of us know about the effect of gentamicin? How many of us have seen patients that have been affected by dosing gentamicin before? You don't have to speak, you can just raise your hand. How many people have seen that before? Nobody. Okay. So gentamycin's nephrotoxicity is related to the cumulative dose given to the patient. So whether you reduce the dose given during during the day, or you give the patient a bolus shot, it will, or once we get to I think 140 milligrams per kg, nephrotoxicity begins to set in. So reducing the dosage to 80 milligrams 3 times a day does not prevent nephrotoxicity with gentamicin. Also, there's type D ADR, which is time-related and delayed. This is also uncommon, usually dose-related, occurs or becomes apparent after the use of the drug. So most of the time, it is after stopping the drug that the reaction or the adverse drug reaction occurs. An example is carcinogenesis, tardive dyskinesia, keratogenesis, and leukopenia with patients that have been prescribed lomustine. There's also type E, which is withdrawal. That occurs at end of use. It's uncommon and occurs soon after withdrawal or immediately after withdrawal. And it is common with when you withdraw opiates or benzodiazepine in patients. Okay. Now there's the type F, which is unexpected failure of therapy. An unexpected failure of therapy is common. You've seen that a lot with it's dose related and is often caused by drug interactions. Now, this can happen, of course, when you're using a medicine or a patient is using a medicine that interacts with their primary treatment. For example, some patients, there have been reports of there have been clinical reports of therapeutic failure when vitamin C was combined with. Yes, please.
Sorry, please, can you change your screen, your slide?
You want to see what I'm saying on that slide?
Yes.
Okay. So basically that gives us the 6 types of general classification. So we looked at 2 types of classifications. We looked at classification based on immune involvement, and the second is the general classification based on the type of reaction. Okay. Any questions at this point? Any questions? Yes, okay.
So I wanted to ask, is addiction considered as an adverse drug reaction?
Addiction, no. Addiction is not considered an adverse drug reaction.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. In the absence of any other question, I'm going to update these slides and then send them out. I realize now that as at the last time I took this class, we had only, we talked about only 4 classifications. Now, there's also the aspect of identification of adverse drug reactions. I'm just going to run through this and then later. So first, factors predisposing to adverse drug reactions. The dose of the drug. For example, I've mentioned a lot, sometimes cumulative dose or just exposing the patient to the medicine gives rise to an adverse drug reaction. Pharmaceutical variation in drug formulation can also cause this. Pharmaceutical variation in drug formulation, for example, switching a patient from a slow release formulation, switching them to an immediate release formulation can cause an adverse drug reaction. And that will usually happen because a medication error occurred. Now, there can also be the pharmacokinetics of the medicine itself. For example, some drugs have a tiny margin of they have a tiny margin of error. So if you dose them if you dose them outside of the range for which it is outside of the range for which they are safe, they may easily result into adverse drug reaction. An example is warfarin. Now, when there are pharmacodynamic abnormalities, for example, some patients may have high plasma proteins in their higher than normal plasma proteins in their body, and this can result into higher plasma binding of drugs with low therapeutic with low protein binding, during clinical trials, and this can result into adverse drug reactions. Also, there are drug-drug interactions. For example, elderly people using 2 or more drugs for the same indication may be at risk of drug-drug interactions. Also, in terms of population that are at significant risk, I had mentioned initially that pediatrics, that children, especially children from the age of 12 and below, the adverse drug reactions are more common in that population. Developmental changes affect the pharmacodynamics and the pharmacokinetics of many of the drugs we use, since most of those drugs are not been tested, they've not been tested in children, right? So what we are usually doing with the dosage we give to children is called there's a word used to describe it, off-label indications, right? Because the children are usually, because of ethical reasons, not involved in clinical trials, right? Also, we should note that gastric emptying is delayed in neonates and infants, so that can result into longer absorption time and potentially increase the risk of an ADR in infants. So don't divide the dose, for a 6-year-old. Just say, oh, your child is 3 years old, so you take half of what is supposed to go to a 3-year-old. That does not always hold, okay? Or you say, oh, this baby is 1 year old, this other one is 6 months. So the one 6 months old should take half of what the 1 year old should take, right? The calculation does not usually work like that because of these changes in pharmacodynamics. So when prescribing or dispensing to pediatric patients, you should be more concerned about the risks for those patients. Also, for geriatrics, those are patients over the age of 60, elderly patients. The percentage of people in this age category continues to rise, and it's important to note that they also have 2 to 6 prescriptions on the average per person, according to a WHO survey, about 2 to 6 prescriptions per person, and that also that does not include the fact that some of them are already taking 2 to 3 over-the-counter medicines, including painkillers, supplements, and nutraceuticals, right? So we should always be careful about dispensing medicines to elderly patients. Now, of all the factors associated with ADRs in elderly patients, polypharmacy is arguably the most important for pharmacist intervention, because all of those drugs, come through you as a pharmacist or come to you as the person who has to dispense them. So one of the ways you identify or you can predict an adverse drug reaction is ensure you go through, once a patient comes to you, ensure you do a medication review with them. Ask them about all of the medicines they are taking and screen all of the medicines they are taking for drug-drug interactions, especially those that are clinically significant. It's very important, which also comes to bear on what you do in the clinic. When you're collecting a patient, be sure to ask about their supplements, pain relievers they're using, herbs that they think are not medicines, that they add to their foods, food additives, all of that. Please ensure you ask about that so that you can document and make it easy to identify sources of adverse drug reactions when they occur. Okay. As the number of drugs also increase, you remember that non-adherence, the risk for non-adherence also increases. So it's important to do interventions that can reduce those challenges. One of the ways to do that is by, how many people can suggest, what ways do you think you can reduce the risk of non-adherence due to polypharmacy? Suggestions? How can we reduce non-adherence due to polypharmacy? Yes, please go ahead, Sylvia.
Counseling, and then asking questions too.
Okay, what else?
Compiled records of each patient that maybe can be distributed in the pharmacies and hospitals that the patient goes to.
Okay. I think one of the things we usually don't immediately profile is that some of those medicines can be duplicated. So identify what is duplicated, remove duplications, and then on the second, on the alternative, provide co-formulations. Do you understand? Are we together?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Sir, please, can you give an example for the
co-formulation? Sorry?
Sir, please, can you give an example for the co-formulation?
Okay, so for example, sometimes you have patients who are taking a diuretic and an ACE inhibitor, right? So an alternative is to look for a co-formulation, for example, co-myocarditis, for example, contains a diuretic and an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor, angiotensin receptor blocker, right? So that's an alternative. There are also alternatives, for example, that contain diuretic and calcium channel blockers. That's for hypertensives. On the other hand, for antibiotics, for example, in patients that are being treated for tuberculosis, there are pill packs that combine all of those 4 medicines into 2 pills. There are some that combine them into that just put them into 1 blister, so it's easy to take all at once. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
So those are 2 interventions: co-formulation or co-packing. Okay. If you, I think you guys are back in the hostel now. So one of the things you can do is at the back of the hall in the clinical pharmacy lab, there are pill packs you'll find there. And the idea behind these pill packs, you can just take a look at them. I think you're continuing on Monday. The pill packs you'll find there. What those pill packs do is they are used to program patients' medicine. So you prevent them from having to open several bottles at a time. So one of those blister packs can take about 5 to 10 medicines, depending on their size. So you put them in the blister packs for the patient, label them for this is supposed to be Monday, Tuesday, or this is supposed to be taken in the morning, in the afternoon, at night. So it simplifies the dosage regimen for the patient, and all they do is just open each of the blisters for the appropriate time and use them, right? So that's an intervention that helps. Now, moving on. There's also the class for patients with renal and hepatic impairment. Most drugs are metabolized by the liver and excreted by the kidneys. Impairment or failure of either of these critical organs can result into changes in drug absorption, drug distribution, bioavailability, CYP metabolism, and of course clearance once the kidney is involved. You have to monitor the patient's laboratory values to ensure that you're on top of this. So monitoring patients' laboratory values to ensure that once the lab values are within range, then you can be sure that the patients, the medicines will follow the appropriate pharmacokinetic principles in the patient, and of course, pharmacodynamics will not be altered in the patient. So there's less likelihood of an adverse drug reaction. But once both of these or any of these are affected, there will definitely be changes in pharmacodynamics, right? Which will affect how the medicine is handled within the body of the patient. Now, these physiologic changes in patients with hepatic impairment can influence drug dosing. For example, some patients with ascites, and I'm sure a number of people have done your clinical posting would have seen this. Ascites usually manifests with a swollen abdomen in patients that sometimes could be hard to touch. And if you palpate on them, you can hear those dull thoughts like you're hitting a balloon filled with water, right? Presence of ascites in a patient with cirrhosis can alter volume of distribution, affect bioavailability of the administered medicines. For example, furosemide, which is usually useful for reducing the volume in the trapped in the abdomen, and of course can also affect the elimination half-life of drugs, since with increasing volume of distribution, there's a longer time for those medicines to be cleared. And of course, this would potentially lead to an increased risk of adverse drug reaction. Decreased hepatic blood flow can also lead to increased bioavailability and, of course, serum drug concentration. And that can also necessitate adjusting the dose in such patients. Usually antipsychotics, anti-anxiety pills, sedatives, all of that. Once there are pharmacodynamic changes, you need to monitor those medicines critically. So some of you who have been posted to renal units, you need to watch for those changes. You need to watch for how medicines are influenced by the different stages of renal failure. Some of you who are in gastro units, you also need to watch for how those changes in hepatic handling of medicines affect how those medicines are dosed to those patients. There's also genetic durability, and that's very important. It was once considered non-preventable, but some ADRs may now be preventable because of the emerging field of pharmacogenomics. Using pharmacogenomic testing can help you provide personalized medicine to certain patients. Now, if a patient is identified as having a genetic predisposition to an ADR for a particular medicine, of course, you will need to either prescribe a different medicine or avoid that, avoid that medicine altogether, or use it in a formulation that's not amenable to that genetic alteration. Now, an important area where this is also interesting is in metabolism of morphine, right? Some patients who have been found to be at risk, who are found to likely who are likely to be more predisposed to getting addicted to opioids may process morphine much more faster and much more readily than patients who seem to use morphine for pain and are not and do not get addicted to it or do not abuse the product. So I mean, I kind of understand where you come from to say, is addiction also a type of ADR? But an addiction is not a type of ADR, saying that the total events that contribute to the occurrence of an ADR are not explainable by just the pharmacokinetics or the pharmacodynamics of the medicine alone. There is a deeper psychological component to addiction than just the pharmacokinetics can explain. Okay. Okay. Now, having identified an adverse drug reaction, how do you manage it? Right. It's important to, the first step I would say is to identify that this is an ADR and not an adverse drug event. If you can identify that an ADR and it's predictable, then you can direct your treatment appropriately. Take for instance, if we look at a patient who has been administered morphine, I'm just presenting a case study. If a patient who has been prescribed morphine and the goal of INR is the goal of the INR for such a patient is that we want to have INR between 2 and 3 for the patient, and that would help ensure that there's no bleeding in the patient, right? If the patient presents, say, 5 days after initiating warfarin, comes back and is having spontaneous bleeding, you know, maybe from the nose, from the gums, there's spontaneous bleeding, and then you check the INR of the patient, find out that their INR is between 2 and 3. Is that an adverse drug event or an adverse drug reaction? That's a question. What?
It's an event, sir.
Okay, why is it an event?
So please, what's the question?
I said that assuming that we initiate the patient on warfarin, right? We assure that this is the dose, and our aim is to ensure that the INR of the patient remains between 2 and 3, and the patient comes back in 5 days' time, and the patient is bleeding in the nose, bleeding in the gums, right? And we clock the patient has been taking the proper dose recommended. We do a INR test, find out that the INR value for that patient is between 2 and 3, just like we proposed. Is that an adverse drug reaction or an adverse drug event?
An adverse drug reaction.
Drug reaction.
Adverse drug reaction.
Okay, so why is there an adverse drug reaction?
Because it was predictable.
It was predictable, okay. Because
There
we were
was a
using the right
relationship.
dose.
There's a relationship.
Correct. There's a relationship between the pharmacology of the drug and the effects that we're seeing, right? Okay, now let's assume that this patient has presented, is bleeding. So what we do is we reduce the dose and the INR target to a target of 2 for this patient. So we reduce the dose and INR target is now 2. Let's assume the bleeding stops and the patient comes back again in about a week, let's say 2 weeks at this time, and the patient's INR, so we track the patient has been using the drug appropriately, but we now find out that patient started using what's the name? St. John's wort. Started supplementing with St. John's wort because they were depressed within the last 5 days, and now they are presented with bleeding, and we do a INR test and we find out that the INR is now that their INR is now 6, right? How would you classify this type of ADR? Would you classify it as a type A, or a type B, a type C, type D, E, or F?
Type F.
Okay. So type F is unexpected failure of therapy. Has the therapy failed? Let me run through the types again. Let me run through the types. So we said type A is dose related, augmented. It's related to pharmacological action of the drug. Is an exaggerated pharmacological response. Predictable. Non-dose related, uncommon, not related to pharmacological action of the drug. Can that be the answer? Can that be the answer? Can type B be the answer? No, cannot. What about type C? Type C says dose related and time related. It's related to the cumulative dose of the medicine. Is that possible?
No.
Okay. Now, type D says usually dose related. Of course, it's delayed. So usually it's after you have finished the whole course of treatment, maybe in weeks after. Is that the case in this patient? Is that the case in this patient?
Kind of.
No, because the patient is still using the medicine. So there's no delay. There's no delayed action. We're actually saying the action while the patient is on the medicine. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Okay. It's also not type E because type E events happen after withdrawal. It's also not type F because there's no failure of therapy. So it's evidently type A adverse drug reaction. Do we understand? That's an exaggerated pharmacologic response. And it happened because of drug-drug interaction.
Sorry, sir. Sir, for type F, you said your cause mostly due to drug interaction.
Yes, it's often caused by drug interaction, but that drug interaction results in failure.
Okay.
In this case, what we have experienced as a result of the drug interaction is an exaggeration of the pharmacological activity. Does that make sense?
A bit, sir.
Okay. Don't worry, when you go over the notes, it will make more sense, right? So, like if you look at the example I have given, what I did was I modified the dose, right? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So for type A drug augmented reactions, you can adjust the dose of the medicine. Okay. For bizarre or non-dose related, you substitute the medicine. So you withdraw that medicine and substitute it with another medicine. Okay. For failure of therapy, of course, you also substitute the medicine, or you remove what the medicines that have been added that resulted in the failure. Okay. For type C and type D, which happens when you have either stopped the medicine. Type C, you have stopped the medicine, so it's at a later date. And then type D, it's also time related. It's usually those related, of course, or becomes apparent after the use of the drugs. For both of those types, what you do is you ensure you do not re-challenge the patient with that same drug, but you manage the side effects being experienced by the patient, okay? So for type A, of course, you can re-challenge with graded doses. And of course, it's important to also educate the patient, to document and educate the patient about their adverse drug reaction. So with that, we quickly go on to talk about adverse drug reaction reporting. Okay. Now, the purpose of documenting is to prevent future injuries so that your patient and others do not suffer the same events, right? New adverse reactions are often discovered when drugs are used in a large population. For example, there are new side effects being documented by the large population exposure that's happening to COVID-19 vaccine. But of course, all of the adverse drug reactions, following immunization, that's very important. Adverse drug reactions following or adverse events following immunization that have been reported so far around the world, or for all of them, none have been related to no severe reaction has been related to the use of the vaccine itself. So it's important to understand or to follow such reports. So once new medicines come into the market, they're being explored. If you remember, rofecoxib. Rofecoxib was withdrawn from the market because of the high incidence of cardiovascular disorders or cardiovascular death that was occurring among the patients that were exposed to rofecoxib. So it's important, once those reports started to get documented, there was a signal was generated because, okay, so another term you need to understand is what is called a signal. A signal is a new report or a higher incidence of a common event that is known to occur due to a medicine. So once you can identify that this event is caused by this drug, it generates a signal. A signal results into clinical review. Once the clinical review is done, regulatory action is taken by the regulator. Okay, so adverse drug reporting allows the regulator to identify when the risk-benefit ratio begins to tip in the balance towards the risk much more than the benefit. Okay, so either the injury is not commensurate to what is being treated, or there are so many patients reporting injury from that particular drug. And when that happens, signal is generated. The signal leads to regulatory action all of the time. Now, very, very important, side effects are not usually documented by ADR reporting to NAFDAC. But other ADRs are reported to NAFDAC because they may lead to regulatory action, or they may lead to significant injury to the patient. So it's important that you, during practice, if you identify an adverse drug reaction that is not a common side effect of that medicine, or you find side effects that are common for that medicine, but they are occurring too frequently, you generate a report, and of course, you attach those reports and send them to NAFDAC. Of course, we use something called a yellow form. How many of us have seen a yellow form before? It may not be yellow, but of course, it's always labeled a yellow form. How many of us have seen a yellow form? How many of us have seen a yellow form? Just raise your hand if you see one. Okay. 3 people have seen a yellow form before. Okay. I'm trying to get a sample so I show you that. Okay. It's published by the National Pharmacovigilance Center that's domiciled in NAFDAC. So this is what a yellow form looks like. And that's what is used in documenting adverse drug reactions in Nigeria. Like I said, it does not have to be yellow, but it has to have all of those form fields. It's usually filled by a pharmacist or a physician, whoever detects or whoever takes the report of the adverse drug reaction. There are 5 main sections. First section is the patient details. So you provide the name, age, patient record number, the sex of the patient, their weight, hospital, that's your own location, either the hospital or the pharmacy. You provide your address. Then the second is where you describe the adverse drug reaction. So first you document what medicines the patient is using under the prescription. You describe the ADR first in the box given. Then you also identify, you put the date the reaction started and when it stopped. Next, you say was the patient admitted due to the adverse drug reaction. If the patient was admitted, you identify, and then the outcome of the reaction is also documented. The next section is the suspected drug section. So you also identify what drug is suspected, what it was being used for. And then section 4, you document all other drugs that the patient is using. Sometimes it may not, other drugs the patient is using may not fit into that small section there, but you can attach pieces of paper or flip it over and just write, copiously on the back of the yellow form. And then number 5 will now take your own details. In Nigeria, the Pharmacovigilance Center takes reports from pharmacists, doctors, and nurses, and any other healthcare practitioner. In the US, adverse drug reports are only accepted from the physician and I think it's taken from physician and pharmacist in the US. Yeah, it's taken from all healthcare providers and the consumers. They have an automated reporting system called MedWatch. In the UK, UK also accepts reports using this same yellow card, the same yellow card used in the UK. Just give me a minute. Let me show you the UK's. Okay, so that's the UK's yellow card for reporting adverse drug reactions. You see that it looks like they have more sense of it. They printed it in landscape so that you can put more information. So that's the only difference between. Churchill, do you have a question? Okay. So that's the only difference between what you have between the UK and Nigeria. Like I said, pharmacists can also report. There are some countries where only pharmacists and doctors are allowed to report, and there are some other countries where only doctors are allowed to report. Now, in Nigeria, like I said, we use the yellow form for healthcare professionals, and then there's the FRASCOR system, which is a short code reporting system that's approved for consumers of health. Now, there are 6 pharmacovigilance centers across the 6 geopolitical zones. One is in University of Lagos Teaching Hospital in Lut. So that pharmacovigilance center takes all of the reports from the Southwest and collates it and sends, after evaluating it, sends the report to Abuja. Now, there's a basic system of grading the severity of classifying severity of the ADRs. And while this is very simple to use, talks about mild, moderate, and severe, and it grades it in sense of says, for mild, it requires minimal therapeutic intervention. For moderate, requires active treatment of adverse reaction. And then for severe, talks about may result in life, in a threat of life, or may result in permanent damage, right? Even while this is a simple system, but it is not objective enough. So there have been several ways that both the outcome and the outcome and causality have usually been evaluated together. So once you're reporting an adverse drug reaction, it's important to also grade the probability of that adverse drug event occurring. That's causality assessment. Those are the 2 other roles that are important for pharmacists when you are reporting on an adverse drug reaction. And like I said, the outcome, you can grade it mild, moderate, or severe. Now, aside from that, you can also assess causality. There are 3 systems that are commonly used. There's a Naranjo ADR probability scale. There's a WHO UNC causality categories, and then there is the Liverpool adverse reaction causality score. Those are used to evaluate how certain they help you assess the certainty that this adverse reaction is caused by this therapeutic regimen that the patient is on. Now, I will quickly talk about the WHO. Okay, let's start with the Naranjo. The Naranjo scale has 10 questions, and it is graded from 0 to 9. So the 10 questions, like I said, I'm going to give you a note that apart from this PowerPoint slide, I'm going to give you a note which contains all of this. Now, the Naranjo scale has 10 questions graded from 0 to 9 to help you assess causality. You can give your own opinion when you are posting your report. Those are considered very, very helpful for the team that will be evaluating the report that you send to the Pharmacovigilance Center. So those 10 questions used by Naranjo include, number 1, are there previous conclusive reports on this reaction? It may require you to do something called a literature review, find if that's already in the literature. So it's either a yes, no, do not know, right? Now, did the adverse event appear after the suspected drug was administered? Yes, no. But of course, all of these questions are weighted differently. So some of them score 1, some of them score 2. Okay. And let me see if I can show you. Okay, I guess you can see my screen, right? Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the Naranjo ADR probability scale. Like I said, if you look closely here, you'll see that there are different gradings for each of the questions, right? And then they are graded either as a positive or a negative. So once you sum up the score here, you sum up the score, you see the scale here. So if you answer all of these questions and you score between 5 to 8, then that's probable. That shows that this reaction may be actually due to the treatment regimen that the patient is using. And once you score anything from probable to highly probable, right, it's important that you report immediately. The regulator will take action on your report. Now, if you rate and it's between possible and doubtful, still document that and report it because it could be novel. What it means is there may not have been a reported event like this before. So reporting it helps to expand, helps us to expand evidence that we have about those drugs, and of course helps us to improve our ability to respond to such adverse drug reactions. So this is the Naranjo ADR probability scale. Let me also show you the WHO-UNC scale. Now, for the WHO-UNC scale, it's a causality category. So it helps us explain, for example, when a causality is graded as certain, it means that there's clinical event or laboratory test abnormality that occurs in a logical time relation to the drug that has been administered, cannot be explained by underlying concurrent disease or other drugs or chemicals. So every requirement for a drug, for an ADR to be classified as certain is listed under here. For an ADR to be considered as probable or likely is listed here. For ADR to be considered as possible is listed here. Okay. Now that's important because sometimes your report gets to, for example, let's talk about the COVID. A lot of things that people have been reporting from COVID. Now, they are evaluated based on these criteria. Once these criteria and it will be pushed to unlikely. Now, it does not mean that other reports will not be critically evaluated. Every report is critically evaluated, but as long as that report does not show any likelihood that this event being experienced, take for example, all those nonsense being shown on social media where somebody puts a key on their and then the key sticks and they tell you that it's because of the COVID vaccine they've taken. All of those are just to bamboozle and confuse people about taking the vaccines, but they are actually highly unlikely events. Okay. Now, the advantage that this system has is that it has something called unaccessible and unclassifiable, which means that we may not have been able to adequately classify this, but we know that something may have happened that is wrong. So we are still documenting it, and then we'll revisit once there are, more reports similar to this. Now, the last one is very complex, and I do not recommend using it. You can see for yourself now. It's a decision. It's a decision ladder that can sometimes get very confusing. Now, having looked at these, we have successfully talked about adverse drug reactions. We have looked at classification of adverse drug reaction. We have looked at identifying adverse drug reaction. We have looked at managing adverse drug reactions. We have looked at outcomes for adverse drug reactions. We have also looked at severity of adverse drug reactions. Do we have any questions for me? Do we have any questions? Do you have any questions for me?